Hi there, students. So we're going to get to a few more slides. Like, we don't even have a whole lot left here as we continue to talk about this idea of assimilation. Now, we talked a little bit in class about how the idea was maybe forced upon you, or if you willingly went along with this idea of Americanization. I want to touch a little bit more on something called the Carlisle Indian School. Now, you probably looked that up and put that on your timeline, but many American Indians preserved their cultures and tribal identities despite government policies promoting assimilation, and they attempted to develop self-sustaining economic practices. So the Carlisle Indian School is one of these instances where they would send young children off to a boarding school, and probably the most famous one was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. There was a man, if you've ever heard of an incredible Olympian named Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe was not his name. That is a very Americanized name that they gave him, and so that was just one instance of you would get an Anglican name or an American name, and he became, probably one of the most famous athletes of the time anyway, in the early 1900s. But the Carlisle Indian School was set out to promote this kind of, what's the word? I think I put like this Protestant ideology. I put this under assimilation on mine. This kind of Protestant ideology that you are Christianized, you have like this monogamous, nuclear family, you learn English, you're educated in school. There's this idea, and the head of the Carlisle Indian School from the very beginning was an old colonel from the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, named Pratt, Colonel Pratt, John Pratt, Henry Platt. And he had this famous saying that was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." That basically meant, like, can you imagine, kill the Indian, save the man? You had to get rid of every last ounce of cultural heritage in order for these people to be saved. And so that did everything from sending them off into like these little boarding schools, actually big boarding schools. They had to, boarding schools for Native American children to assimilate, taught the importance of private property. You would have stayed there. You probably would have lived at a boarding school for many years, and you really didn't go home. Like summers, you didn't really go home. And so this was all kind of this whole practice of promoting assimilation. The Dawes Act, you look that up, that was that policy of giving land to Native Americans to kind of get them to be farmers. Of course, they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the know-how, but hey, just go start farming, that kind of idea. The ghost dance, we know that this is where Sitting Bull was killed. So these are all kind of ways to push assimilation on groups such as Native Americans. The Gilded Age witnessed new cultural and intellectual movements in tandem with political debates over economic and social policies. New cultural and intellectual movements both buttressed and challenged the social order of the Gilded Age. Social commentators advocated theories later described as social Darwinism to justify the success of those at the top of the socioeconomic structure as both appropriate and inevitable. Now, I do want to talk about this idea of social Darwinism that is also on the list here. The idea of social Darwinism is almost like an extent of manifest destiny, where the strong survive. And when we're talking strong in this case, we're saying like the financially strong, and the weak are going to die out. And so anytime there was this great gap, which we've talked about in income between the rich and the poor, it was a good excuse for the rich to be like, well, that's just the way it is. Like, the poor just die out because they're too dumb to make it on their own. This was really kind of a sad look at society. Wow, I really butchered that laissez-faire policy. But again, these laissez-faire policies of just let businesses do as they want, and we can't really help you. You help yourself type of idea. And so there was very little civic-minded social responsibility for people who found themselves in just a never-ending cycle of almost poverty. It didn't really help to think about, or when books came out, I'm going to move this over here, like Horatio Alger, and he wrote these books. They were called dime novels. They were especially for like boys, but they were called The Rags to Riches Story. And Horatio Alger would write these lovely stories about like how you could become rich just with hard work and ingenuity and this go-get-emness. And really, in all honesty, that's not how it was. But he continued to kind of foster this, and people clung to it. You know, they would be like these 5-cent little books, and like they thought that it could happen that way. In all reality, it probably didn't. We talked a lot about or a little at least, about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and until 1882, a lot of Chinese were coming in that created competition, that created intimidation for a lot of whites, especially in the Pacific areas. And so then all of a sudden the government just like does away with all Chinese immigration. All right. So the Gilded Age is definitely not a pretty time underneath the surfaces. Some business leaders argued that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help the less fortunate and improve society, as articulated in the idea known as the gospel of wealth, and they made philanthropic contributions that enhanced educational opportunities in urban environments. So if you watch the video on The Men That Built America, episode 7, you see when Carnegie basically sold his company, Carnegie Steel, and it became U.S. Steel, he became like the richest man in the world. And while he had a bad reputation, you know, like for the Homestead strike and things like that, this is what it kind of gave him the opportunity to use his wealth in a good way. And he, you know, Carnegie is the one who said, like, if you die rich, you die what's the word? There was a phrase, when you are shamed, you die like shameful. And so he wrote this story, or this book called The Gospel of Wealth, and he talked about how there's a moral responsibility of society to help those who are less fortunate, but the only way to help those less fortunate are to provide them opportunities. Like, you can't just give them money. So Carnegie would have never just given money to the poor. He would have done things like built libraries and places, given it to higher education, given it to people who could do something with it, but they had to do something for themselves. But once again, if you remember about Carnegie, that's the idea. This is where he was a self-made man. You know, he came from nothing. And so he said, anybody can have the opportunity. You just got to have the opportunities placed for you. But I'm not going to just give it to you. You got to want it. And so this is Carnegie's idea in The Gospel of Wealth. Poverty is a moral failing. You have to help those for them to help themselves. And it was your Christian duty to get involved in social justice issues. So this is what this book, The Gospel of Wealth, is about. And I put that under social reform up here. When we get to, we'll get to settlement houses in here in a little bit. There's a couple more things that I want you to add. Vanderbilt University, you know, Vanderbilt gave $1 million at that time to start Vanderbilt University. He's never been to the South. There's lots of lingering kind of issues, but he gives this money kind of at the end of his life and gets his name after it, when in fact it's probably not even that much money. Stanford University, that is, he was a senator, Leland, I believe, Sanford. He and his wife started Stanford University. There was a story, I think their child had died, and they felt like they had nothing to carry on their legacy, and so they started a university out in California. Okay. We've talked a little bit about Mark Twain's Gilded Age. Progress in, we did talk about Century of Dishonor. Remember, that is the Native American story that came out about how badly over the century Native Americans were treated and kind of the truth was being exposed. How the other half lives, Jacob Riis, you for sure need to know. In fact, this idea that Jacob Riis put out there very much took that idea of social Darwinism and dumped it on its head. Like the idea that, well, they're getting what they deserve. And then Jacob Riis shows these pictures of like children, like in the streets, children sleeping in like, how could you ever justify that a child deserves to live in poverty? Like they've done nothing wrong. And so Jacob Riis really took this idea of social Darwinism and said, that's not how it should go. You can make it make sense however you want in your mind, but morally, that's wrong. Jacob Coxey's March on Washington, Jacob Coxey took about like 500, I don't have a number, many workers who were unemployed after the Panic of 1893, took hundreds of workers and they marched from Pennsylvania down to Washington, D.C. as basically a protest and a demand for some government assistance because people were just living in poverty after the Panic of 1893. All right, this one, I'm not going to go through a ton with you because we are going to talk about some of these policies more in the next chapter, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Sherman Antitrust Act. Actually, no, I'm not going to talk about the Sherman Antitrust Act. I'm going to talk about that coming up in a couple of days. So we're going to skip over this one, actually. This one I'll touch on just a little bit. Many women sought greater equality with men, often joining voluntary organizations, going to college, promoting social and political reform like Jane Addams, working in settlement houses to help immigrants to adapt to U.S. language and customs. So this is the one that you should probably put back here on social reform. You need to put this lady's name. Her name was Jane Addams, and she started a settlement house. It was known as the Hull House. The Hull House was the first one was started in Chicago, and there were many others throughout the whole United States. Jane Addams started her Hull House as kind of like, first of all, just a place where immigrants could go to truly find out about where I can get childcare. How do I get a job? Where can I find a place to live? And it was kind of like just a place that you went to get any sort of resources as a new immigrant. And then eventually the Hull Houses became kind of these centers of like a community center almost. And so Jane Addams was quite influential in helping especially immigrant families come into the United States and really just get settled. Good government movements. This is when they wanted to create more like parks and open areas for people to enjoy, because if you're living in tenement housing, you're not really getting out, getting a lot of fresh air. So they wanted to make more parks and open areas for people to enjoy. We've got the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Women still don't have suffrage rights yet in 1890. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is probably your gal. I mean, she is your Susan B. Anthony. These are your women for the American Suffrage Association, the head of them. Carrie Catt and Margaret Sanger. Well, I don't really want to talk about Margaret Sanger a whole lot. She promoted eugenics. She basically said that Native Americans, immigrants probably should be stripped of their rights because, they can't have more than rights than like women should have. And Margaret Sanger, not a great, but very much of a feminist, very much of a movement for suffrage and for women. Co-ed colleges are coming. The City Beautiful movement, this is kind of like the good government idea. So last thing, nope, that was the last thing. What we'll talk about on this slide is I'm going to bring in just a little bit of this slide as well. And so until we talk again, bye-bye.